So, last one before coffee. I hope to have a good discussion here. It's the state of the cell and gene therapy industry in Europe, and I wondered what that exam question was. I thought maybe a state of the nation address or something like that. But Europe isn't a nation, it's a union. There are member states, there are some things pooled, there are some things done at local level, and my colleagues here have negotiated the lot, which is why I'm going to really milk them for every answer I can get here. We've got Christian Homsy. He's the CEO of Celyad. He's well known to many of you. He's got phase 3 trials due to read out relatively soon with autologous stem cells in ischemic heart failure, but has also more recently got NK cell-based CAR T therapies, which look very exciting. We also have Jörn Aldag, CEO of uniQure, again known to many of you. He's got a terrific gene therapy company, and he's best known for getting the first approval in gene therapy with Glybera, with a putative €1 million, million something price tag. So we've got, Europe's done pretty well in advanced therapies. We've got 5 or so ATMPs, some older ones like Macy, Condra Select, Provenge, Glybera obviously, and the most recent is Holoclar, which is limbal stem cell treatment brought to the market by Chiesi, Italian pharmaceutical company, who've made a big investment in the area. Of course, GSK have filed for ADA SCID. So, you know, things are looking good there, but you know, European companies have benefited from the surge in investment of the last several years. I think there's a dozen or so companies presenting from Europe out of the 50 or so here, so well represented. Long-established companies like Selectis, Reneuron, Oxford Biomedica, Adaptimmune, Celyad, uniQure are doing really well. I'm going to turn over now to actually ask the kind of exam question, starting with Jörn, which is, what's it taken to get there? What have you had to do to get as far as you've got, and how's that European context helped or hindered you? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, you mentioned kindly that we're the first company that ever got a gene therapy approved in Europe, and I think to actually get there was obviously, like always when you are at the forefront of innovation, quite a significant struggle. I would identify 3 things that were important for us as a company to be successful. And the first one was to look at things from the end backwards. So we didn't ask the question, how do we get a proof of concept in a gene therapy? We were asking the question, how do we get a drug in the gene therapy space to patients? And that required a whole lot more than just driving something to proof of concept. It required to be good in vector design, in promoters. We needed to understand the biology. We needed to have manufacturing in place. And we invested early on into manufacturing, and that actually helped us to get Glybera to a quantity that we could run a phase 3 trial and get it all the way through the regulatory process. We continued then to invest into manufacturing because we knew that we were going to build a larger company and build a plant of 55,000 square foot with 2,000 liter bioreactors in Lexington, Massachusetts. And this view on closing the entire value chain up until the patient, I think, was critical for us and is certainly substantially witnessed by the fact that we recently closed a $2.5 billion deal with BMS on a cardiovascular asset, where one of the main criteria for BMS to select us as a company was that ability to be able to manufacture for clinical phase 3 grade and scale, and even be able to launch from there. So that's point number 1, looking at it from the back end forwards. What do you have to do to get a gene therapy to market? The second thing, I think, and this is why this little workshop here is a bit funny, is that we're talking about Europe here. Actually, one of the success factors for us was to think about things as being global. We're in a global industry, in particular in financial markets. This is critically important, and you don't happen to have the chance to open the window for financing in a geography where you live. You have to grab the bull by the horn where the market is actually open and where you can get capital. And that may well be in the US for a European company, and you all know that we are listed on NASDAQ because the window was wide open at the time. But what it requires for a European company is to be comparable, to be benchmarked, to be as good as US companies, both on financial terms, SEC regulation, but also your scientific programs. So that was the second one, being global. And the third one, I think that was almost the most important, is being persistent. We've been rejected 3 times by the European Medicines Agency with Glybera. Obviously, this was the first gene therapy, and it was difficult for people to judge. Everybody was learning. And we knew that there was a sentiment in the FDA, in the European Medicines Agency, that they wanted a gene therapy to be approved. And they had established bodies like the Committee for Advanced Therapeutics and others, a process by which advanced therapeutics could actually progress towards market. And we sensed that, yet we also sensed the resilience and the resistance by them. And to overcome this, not to give up, not to take no for an answer and go through it, I think not only got Glybera approved, but opened a huge wave of financings and new company foundations in Europe and the US in the gene therapy space.
Okay, great. What about yourself, Christian?
Well, I agree with everything Jörn had just said. Resilience. I'm not sure that if those elements are particular to Europe, or if they're the same in Europe and the US. We have to be resilient. We have to think about with the end in mind. Of course, we have to when you're inventing new therapies like uniQure and us, you need to think not just about the product but about the whole value chain. How do you get the product to the patient's bed without destroying it, without having a poor quality? How do you make it easy for the physician to use that product? But I think those questions are global, and they're not particular to Europe. We're if I were running a US company, I think it would be the same. What is maybe more unique to Europe, because we are in a much smaller environment in terms of ecosystem in the biotech industry in Europe, is that we probably have to be more global than US companies that already on the home turf have access to that large market, have access to the large pool of investment. So we have to think, if we're based in Europe, we have to think about the US, we have to think about Japan, we have to think about Asia very early on in our development pathway.
Have you felt this is really interesting, this kind of being more kind of globally streetwise, and I'd agree. There's a kind of there's almost a stage-like mechanism when firms are coming out of the US and then thinking, oh, I've done it in the US, I need now to go to Europe. And of course, you're both industry veterans across the biotech space for a long time, so you know what kind of works. So give me a little more sense of that kind of USP that comes from that global European approach. I.e., do you sometimes think that you know the mechanisms globally better than other people because you have to, rather than because you need to? It's a tough question. I don't know.
I think the fact that we are in Europe, we have to deal with 28 different countries, with 28 different, maybe not 28 different cultures, but close to. Yeah. And we have to adapt to all of this. And we probably have to be nimble enough to adjust to those various approaches. Maybe in the US, you don't need to be as nimble as that on that front, at least. But there are other challenges in the US as well. I mean, you're going to have to compete probably with more science than what we have in Europe and things like that. You know?
Good. So one of the things that is unique about Europe, of course, is that we've got, if you like, national regulation for clinical trials and facilities inspection, but you've got European level approval for the products. I'll ask the question to both of you, but maybe we'll start with Christian. How did you set about doing that? I mean, you're based in Belgium. Did you, when you put together your strategic plan about how you're going to migrate through the systems, what was in your mind about that kind of national versus EU level regulation?
So there is a pathway in Europe in which you could get kind of an advice from the European Medicine Agency that should be transferred to the countries, and the countries should approve your trial based on that advice. Now, all the countries are represented into that body. We have always refrained from engaging into that avenue because we felt that it's the least common denominator that would win in those type of forums. The advantage of being in Europe is that you can get a no from one country, you can get a yes from another country in clinical trials at least. Whilst in the US, it's the FDA that runs all of the US. So that is something that allows us maybe to tailor ourselves and find ways where we can get approval in certain countries.
So you can get traction and early proof of principle.
Yeah.
What's your experience?
Well, our experience is with an ultra-orphan drug in the area of ATMPs, Advanced Therapeutics Medicinal Programs, and I would expect that many of you here are actually falling into that category. The nice thing here in Europe is that when you have small markets and the economics of a certain product will not be sort of massive because it's not a blockbuster, you are looking for an efficient way to get approval in Europe. And under the ATMP regulation, there is a central procedure. So you have to go through London and the European Medicines Agency, and once you get an approval there, you're approved in all the European countries. That's a major advantage, I think, because it eliminates the necessity to deal on a national level with all the different requirements in those national markets. I would love to see the same thing in the reimbursement sector, where it's not the case, where you have to go through each individual country, do your country-by-country negotiations, develop your individual value dossiers for pricing and so on, which is a very cumbersome process for a little company like the typical biotech company that we're looking at here.
Sure. And of course, you're the first one to go out with the big price tag. And of course you partnered with Chiesi as well on this one. So, do you want to speak to the thinking behind that kind of reimbursement strategy? Because it's got to be done on a country-by-country basis.
Yeah, so the reimbursement strategy here, the first question is what price actually is justified, obviously. And what we do realize is that in many countries, when you talk to reimbursement people, they understand the strategic rationale of a curative treatment, that you have to look at lifetime costs and not the initial price tag of a drug. So very often in the press, people write, this is the $1 million drug, and uniQure has the most expensive drug in the world. Well, it's not true, because you're administering it only once. And if you look over time, the cost is actually much less than what the average orphan drug costs today on an annual basis. You do find people on the reimbursement level who understand this and lead a discussion which is very objective and very, very much directed by the core value dossier that describes the advantage the drug gives patients, and do understand that a price tag, a significant price tag, can be useful and necessary. So you don't actually get pushback on that. The one question I think that is on people's mind is that a high price tag in the beginning obviously is more difficult for the healthcare system than if you would find ways of spreading the burden over a longer period of time by establishing annuity-based pricing. And I was quite surprised yesterday in the discussion about pricing here and the reimbursement that subject wasn't really touched. Everyone says there's this transient relationship of a patient to insurance company here in the US. In Europe, you don't have that problem. but also longer-term contracts with patients aren't something that are readily accepted. So we do have to be creative with reimbursement about business models that allow to capture the value of your providing with a curative treatment over a longer period of time in a combination of down payment and annuity payments. And I think every one of us would be readily accepting a sort of benefit-based, results-based payment schedule that stops when there is no more benefit from the drug.
Yeah. Yeah. What about yourself? I mean, you've got a different, certainly with heart cell, you've got a different product. It's going to have a different pricing dynamic. You must be thinking through how you're going to approach that and what have you. So it's a little different there. So
it's a little different, but not that different, because at the end of the day, because of the ultra-orphan indication, the overall price tag for society is maybe even less in uniQure's terms than it is for ours. So the issue is very much there. And I agree totally with Jörn. I think we need to find ways that are acceptable to the public and success-based, as opposed to just price it, and annuity-based, and the number of days the patient or years the patient doesn't go into intensive care for heart failure is a measure that is of importance to the overall cost. So yeah, we're certainly open to that. We have not yet seen a lot of examples or successful examples of translation of that strategy, but that's certainly something that we would push very strongly.
Yeah, okay. And do you think that because the Europe's dominated by either state insurance systems or national health systems, that actually you might not get the price you'd like, but at least because they're seeing the full economic costs in their economy, do you think there's more ability to get traction with those kind of pricing discussions versus, if you like, the US insurance-based system with the patient mobility and what have you?
Looking at the 80-20 rule, it's certainly easier because you don't have to talk to as many people and to as many interactions between individual insurance companies. So we do see that, and again in the orphan sector, for example in Germany, by law, orphan drugs have to be reimbursed during a period of 1 year at your ask price. And it is only once negotiations have taken place after analysis of the core value dossier that the agency will start to, the reimbursement agency will start to discuss with you a discount. But getting a guaranteed price initially is already very helpful to establish your drug, and then you have to be well prepared for the discount discussions. And then typically Europe works by sort of price baskets. If 2 or 3 countries have accepted a price range, the likelihood of others following that without doing the same intense analysis is fairly substantial.
Okay, I think you said earlier on that the regulators kind of felt pressure to approve the ATMPs, i.e. they wanted them to come through. Where do you think that's coming from? Because I think it's true as well. What do you think is the underlying political push for that?
Well, I think this is a very complex question, and whether the statement they're actually feeling a push is true, I'm not quite certain, but I find that there are some people in the system that are actually quite entrepreneurial and do want advanced therapeutics medicinal products to be approved. It's in the nature of regulators to not be incentivized easily by novel drugs to market, but by avoiding risk.
Right.
There is not a lot of risk avoidance incentive in those systems, and therefore, even when the ecosystem, the environment wants a drug or a class of drugs or a novel technology to be approved, you're still facing in Europe a large body of people who tend to avoid risk. And this is why Glybera had to go through 3 cycles to actually get approved. Yeah. But what you can see in Europe is that the European Commission has established this process of ATMP approvals It contains the CAT, the Committee for Advanced Therapeutics, which is actually, and you all know Europe is 27 member countries, and they vote. And democracy is not necessarily the best way to assess novel science. So they established the CAT, which is an expert body to look at these novel technologies where there's less experience, and sort of the look in the past helps you to understand and come to an assessment here. You've got to look forward what it actually means. And this is where the Europeans on the European Commission level have actually done a lot to establish these bodies and to also publicly report how many advanced therapeutics are actually coming to market. Yeah. And if that's only 5 in 7 or 8 years, and you look at the taxpayers' money behind that, no one is really happy about it, and there is the pressure that starts to be sensed by them to work with you towards the solution of specific problems. And we felt that there were individuals like the chairman of the CAT and other people who really proactively supported us and told us in personal discussions what needed to be done to overcome the regulatory hurdles.
Have you found the same, Christian, that kind of willingness to help?
There is a strong push, certainly from the political level, MPs, European Parliament, to make those products available for patients, at least on the regulatory side. Then on pricing and reimbursement, it's a separate issue. But at least on the regulatory side, there is certainly, they've put those bodies in place, the CAT, and there is a strong wish to do things. But at the end of the day, it's like here, data tells.
Yeah.
I mean, if you get good data, you're going to get the approvals.
Yeah, absolutely. So absolutely, data speaks. And the stronger the signal, the louder it shouts.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But there are shades of grey.
Yeah.
You still want to get approvals.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked a little bit about the kind of political and government support there, and of course I represent the manifestation of that support, at least in the UK. There's similar things in Fraunhofer and other areas where, institutions like the Catapult have been set up to help accelerate innovation and industry. You get collaborative R&D awards at the country level, but also Horizon 2020. I mean, I think you had an FP7 award at one point.
Four
of them. Did you get any?
Yes.
Right. And I mean, was that certainly in the early days? Was that a big help for you in getting traction? I mean, there's an enormous amount of money going in from these Horizon 2020. It's just huge in this sector alone.
Yeah, I must say we benefited from it. At the same time, I'm not a great fan of them.
Yeah.
Very often they have ideas like you have to build consortia and work with other people, and you only get money if you have 3 or 4 working together. That's not necessarily in your interest to do that.
But when the financing window's closed, you'll grab it.
Yes, then you do it, obviously.
Yeah.
What I much prefer is a system that they have in Holland, which is that they give you loans that they forgive in case of no success, in which you have to pay back if you are successful. And we've had great support in the development of Glybera in the order of 7 or 8 million euros that we could deploy in this program, which we now gradually have to pay back.
Yeah. And I know Belgium is, as a state, is very supportive of the industry as well.
Belgium is actually a kind of federal state, so we have regions in Belgium as well, and the region we are in has been extremely supportive. We got 30 million worth of forgivable loans for the development of our uniQure product, and I agree also with the European programs. They tend to be, and I know they're trying to make it simpler, but they tend to be relatively complex, and you have to bring together many parties, and they have to agree and share IP, and it's a machine that probably consume as much resources than the resources we get from it.
Yeah.
So
I tell my guys only to go for the big ones. Yeah. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about financing again now. I mean, you both started off with more European finance, and now you've got more US finance. Certainly in the UK, funds like the Neil Woodford's fund have really helped some UK companies like Reneuron and some others with major financing. Have you got any tips for people about European financing, where to go, how to blend it with global financing? I know one of your companies, it's not uniQure, but one of the others is financed out of Switzerland, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, from my personal perspective, if you can list on NASDAQ, and if you can enter the ecosystem of the U.S. financing industry, then that certainly is a plus. There's so many more analysts here, specialized investors that understand what you're doing, that in particular when you talk about gene therapies at a time that no one else talks about it, you need a PhD to understand actually what the benefits are and what the risks are of what you're doing there. And I find that in the US you find many more people. The system here, the financing system for public companies, offers you a market that has very high volatility and liquidity. Many more players in there, many players with very different assumptions and investment strategies and horizons. This is somewhat different in Europe. So if you get an IPO done in Europe, and my second company, Molecular Partners, listed on the Swiss Stock Exchange, very similar in terms of it's a technology platform like we are, about the same valuation, about the same number of people. If you look at the trading of our company here in the US, it's 300 to 400,000 shares on a day, but also we decline with the market 40-50%, as we've just witnessed over the last 2, 3, or 4 weeks. My Swiss company, Molecular Partners, has a trading volume of about 20,000 shares. You see the market decline here in the US 40-50%, and the stock price of Molecular Partners doesn't move.
Yeah.
So that's good. And one of the reasons is that people don't react on short term. They're in it when they decide to go in it, they invest for a longer horizon, and they just hold on to the stock, which is a big advantage as well. So both have pluses and minuses. I do prefer the intense interaction in the context of the US investment community about what you're actually doing.
Okay, and your experience, Christian?
I think we could not have gone to the US at the beginning of our story. So the fact that we went public first that we raised private money and then public money in Europe was a stepping stone for us to get to the US. I think there's a question of maturity. As you know, when the project is mature enough, then US investors will be willing to look at companies coming to see them from Europe. But there was also something that was said to us is why do you list on NASDAQ? US investors will invest in European companies. And we have found that may be true, but it's actually not always true. Investors would want to see you, and they will see you more if you're in the US than if you're in Europe.
Yeah. Interesting. I think the patient European investor is very different. I know that Neil Woodford's fund is actually called Patient Capital, so he'll stay in for a long time. Okay, well, we're nearly coming to the end now. I think that the last couple of things I wanted to really talk about were the kind of science base and the ability to get talent in Europe. Christian, have you been able to get it from Europe, or have you had to go out globally to get the right people?
It depends for what jobs. For fundamental research, I think we have everything we need in Europe. There's a lot of talent and knowledge. Maybe for more operational jobs or regulatory or clinical, I think the experience we have with people here is probably broader, and also the attitude of a can-do attitude is probably a bit more present in the US than it is in Europe. But that's about being global. You need to take the best of both worlds and try to play where they are.
Jörn?
Yeah, so one of the reasons why we established our facility in Lexington outside of Boston is obviously the pool of talent that is there. Having said that, we have great scientists over in Europe. We have great science in academia. And the core asset, which was part of our BMS deal, this S100A1 protein for congestive heart failure, came out of the University of Heidelberg. And I'm seeing a number of other academic institutes who just provide terrific science in the space that we're in. So I wouldn't say there's only talent in the US. There's great talent in Europe. The US has the advantage of the ecosystem in Boston, which I think is stellar and remarkable on a world context, because that's where everybody meets and where you just find people you need. So being in Europe and in Boston, I think, is a great combination.
Yeah, very good. So we're almost out of time. I'll maybe take a question in a minute, but my takeaways so far are successful European firms know how to navigate Europe, but they're global from day one. Companies are being formed, they are growing, and the regulators, and the governments will support you going through that. At the end of the day, it's going to be tough to get paid, but there are ways to get paid if you know the system. Yeah. Okay, so with that, maybe I'll take any one or two questions, and then we'll go for coffee. One question. No questions? It's coffee time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.